I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space. And
the challenge was issued by the President of the United States to get humans to the moon and back. A massive public goal set to the backdrop of increasing tensions fueled by the Cold War.
The major motivation was political. There's a rivalry with the USSR, trying to beat them to the moon. But there's definitely scientific return to be had from a trip to the moon. There were a lot of competing ideas about how the moon actually formed that we couldn't solve without samples from the moon's surface. Was the moon something that had formed along with the Earth, that had spun off of the young Earth, had been captured by the Earth? So those are the kinds of questions that could only be answered by sending people to collect the right samples from the surface.
This ambitious goal would require some of the finest minds in science, innovating new technologies, and overcoming a bevy of hurdles never attempted before. Many of the Apollo mission's most important and innovative moments were rooted right here in Virginia at the Langley Research Center.
So the NASA Langley Research Center has an amazingly rich history with America's human spaceflight program. A lot of people don't know this, but it actually started right here.
NASA Langley was the first NASA center, and we grew out of NACA, National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. We are over 100 years old. The Space Act of 1958 formed NASA, and we were the first NASA center. We formed the Space Task Force, and we worked Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. And we sent the Space Task Force to Houston to start up the Johnson Space Center.
Virginia is where the astronauts learned how to land on the surface of the moon. This is where they learned how to walk in reduced gravity of the moon. And those are really important contributions to America's human spaceflight program.
Well, Virginia was important to the Apollo missions because of the role that the NASA centers here played in training the astronauts. You just needed to have the familiarity with the controls and just the mental preparedness to go into that unknown situation. Training in places like Langley Research Center were critical to building that preparedness for what they were going to see on the moon.
Preparing for this journey to the moon would also include creating a novel new approach that would go on to be used by this group of astronauts and every Apollo mission to follow.
The Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, LOR, this was something that NASA Langley is quite known for. That may very well be Langley's biggest contribution to Apollo.
One of the most dangerous and challenging aspects of the mission was figuring out how to get our astronauts off the moon and back to the Earth.
I mean, if you're thinking about science fiction, the science fiction characters would get on their rocket ship on Earth and they would go to moon. They would land their rocket ship on moon. They would get out and do whatever and then get back in their rocket ship and come back to Earth. Well, this is not the way it can be done because of the gravity, the force of gravity on Earth, and then there's a force of gravity on moon as well. And it takes a great deal of force to overcome the force of gravity on a planetary surface, be it Earth or moon. So you need a large rocket with a lot of fuel to do this. So a large rocket is heavy, a lot of fuel is heavy, so the problem keeps getting compounded. Working out the numbers, obviously what had to happen was a lighter landing module had to be used to get down to the lunar surface, and more importantly, a very lightweight ascent module had to come up off the lunar surface. The only way to do this was to rendezvous in lunar orbit with the command and service module that would be orbiting.
The whole mission design is pretty complicated. They settled on something called Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. So it involves two small spacecraft. They're launched on top of the same rocket. And just after you leave Earth orbit, they've got to dock the two spacecraft together. so they can journey to the moon. They get to the moon, they undock, of course the lander goes and lands on the moon. They do their moonwalks, they get a little rest period on the moon, and then what was considered perhaps the most dangerous part of the mission takes place. The lunar module has to bring the two astronauts that landed back into orbit around the moon. Then the lunar module and the command module rendezvous with each other, and they have to dock again in orbit around the moon.
When the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous was first proposed, it was very controversial. It was considered very dangerous because this rendezvous had to take place in lunar orbit, and if something went wrong, there would be no way that we could save the astronauts. They would be too far from home. So there was a lot of pushback on this, but Langley, NASA Langley Research Center kept insisting that this was the way to do this, and it turned out it was the way that it had to be done. Finally this was adopted. It took a long time for this to be adopted, but thanks to the NASA Langley engineers, this was what was adopted. I might add it was against the advice of the President's science advisor, but this is what we were going to do. In order to train for this, the astronauts had to have a simulator, and the simulator was here at NASA Langley, and it was called the Rendezvous Docking Simulator, appropriately named because they were going to rendezvous with the Lunar Excursion Module with the Command and Service Module. These two vehicles, if you will, would dock, join together, lock together, and then the two astronauts who'd been on the moon would climb from one to the other, and they would eject this Lunar Excursion Module. They wouldn't carry this back home with them, and then the three would come home.
Making sure they could really dock reliably every time. It was a big part of the preparation for all of the Apollo missions, and that was a critical stage, was getting everybody back into the command module for the trip home. A lot of the practice that they did for docking the spacecraft together, that happened right here in Virginia.
Every year, NASA Langley holds an art contest, and we send that, and encourage kids in K through 12 from around the nation to participate and to send us their paintings, their drawings. And it is amazing to see how kids between the ages of 5 and 18 today are still pulling upon those iconic images of the space shuttle, of early flight, of Apollo. And what's really exciting is to see where they're taking it and to see what their visions are for future human exploration of space. So to me, one of the most amazing things about Apollo is that it crossed so many generations, and it's continuing to inspire to this day. And so it's really exciting to think about how this next generation of Artemis and the future work that we're going to be doing, not only just traveling to the moon and back home, but traveling to the moon and staying there and exploring it and spending months on the surface. How is that going to inspire the next generation? I can't wait to see.
So the Apollo program returned a wonderful trove of samples, and we're still learning from those today. But the Apollo program was also, they were playing it safe to a certain degree. Most of their landing sites were, very safe locations. They were near the moon's equator. Most of them were on the low-lying flat plains. Going back to the moon is valuable because we can explore different areas. So the initial return is targeting the south pole of the moon. That's an area that the NASA's been interested in visiting for a long time. For at least a couple of decades now, they've been talking about going to that location because of the presence of water, using that as a place to set up a permanent presence on the moon.
July 20th, 2019 will mark the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 lunar landing. Virginia's impact on this mission is undeniable, and Langley researchers are now looking to the past accomplishments as inspiration for new and upcoming lunar missions in the near future, further strengthening the tie between Virginia and the moon.